back, everybody. My name is Liz Mosley, and I'm going to be editing this next session, the second of today's Tortoise G7 Billion Summit. I'm slightly nervous, I have to say. We've got an incredibly, just a really incredible lineup for people who will join us for today. My colleague Mary Mills is taking over from me in the chat, and should there be a disaster with my sound, I lost sound briefly in the opening session, she's going to gamely step up to take over the discussion. And what we're going to try and tackle today, as James just mentioned, for those of you that were here for Pascal Soyo on the opening keynote today, is the question of whether in rebuilding and recovering from the shock of the coronavirus that took the world by surprise, but that has caused so much very real pain and damage to people in all kinds of ways, whether in the way we approach the recovery we can focus on equality and use this as an opportunity to, I hesitate to use the rather tired phrase, build back better, or whether all of the efforts that had gone into improving the inequalities across the world for all sorts of people prior to the coronavirus hitting us all so hard will be forgotten and sort of rather treated as nice to have non-core activities. I read a quote in my preparation for this session from Sophia Speckman, who's the Secretary General of the Care International, and she wrote on 1st of July, "Let me be clear, the longer term impact of COVID-19 will not be equal for men and women. We are currently experiencing the highest setback in gender equality for a generation." It's not an altogether optimistic and exciting start. And one of our guests this morning, Julia Gillard, former Prime Minister of Australia, has often been sort of labelled as a self-proclaimed optimist. I'm going to start with you, Julia, if I may. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. As well as obviously formerly being Prime Minister of Australia, you're chair of the Global Partnership for Education and the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Now, I hope my data is right, that if 5 of the 21 people on the World Health Organization Emergency COVID Committee are women, and 2 of the 27 people on the US, for example, COVID Task Force are women. And while 90% of frontline healthcare workers are women, but only 1 in 4 of people in leadership roles in healthcare are women, how could we possibly expect the recovery to prioritise, for example, gender equality when there just aren't women in the room?
I agree with your analysis entirely. I think one of the things that we've seen with this COVID pandemic is that so many of the decision-making structures were male coming to the crisis. Then the new structures swung in to deal with the crisis were also overwhelmingly male. And that means that women's voices and women's perspectives haven't been at the decision-making tables the way they should be. Interestingly, when women have been in the lead in countries like New Zealand and Norway and Germany, etc., the world has been full of praise for their leadership, and there is actually now research from the UK which shows that nations led by women do have lower death rates from the COVID virus than comparable countries. And I think many are applauding the strong and empathetic leadership that many of those women are showing.
I did feel, I interviewed actually for a Thinking Professor Kamban Bhatti, who was one of the co-authors of that report that I think you're referring to. And really the sort of preliminary findings that she had made was that it was largely in achieving lower mortality rates in those countries with female leaders. It was largely to do with locking down earlier, the sort of sense that a quick and decisive decision driven by whatever be the driver, whether it be greater empathy or whatever be the driver, would seem to have been the thing that was the main sort of reason for that. I just wonder, at one stage earlier in lockdown, I did feel optimistic, and that there was talk of, well, now we've come to realise the value of care work, both paid and unpaid, perhaps in the way that we reconfigure the economic flow of value. Perhaps things stand to change because care work being so much a part of what affects women's economic viability, if you like. Did you have that sense of optimism early on, and is it still there? I'm not sure mine has lasted through lockdown, I have to say.
Well, hopefully I can renew some of that spirit of optimism.
Too.
I'll do my best. Look, I think it's still to play for, frankly. I think there's still opportunities for us, if we are campaigning and mobilised, to be raising equality as something that should be factored in, thought about, brought to the forefront as we build back better, to use the buzz phrase. And by that, I mean not just the re-evaluation of women's work, of caring work that you refer to, but also the way that we look at economic development. This has been a recession around the world that has predominantly cut a swathe through women's jobs. It's brought to the fore the nature of casualised and insecure employment. As we re-gear economies, get them going again, we can address that if we choose to. We can make sure as a global community that the principal people who miss out from things like education aren't women. With my Global Partnership for Education hat on, I'm deeply concerned that without further efforts, when schools reopen in developing countries, the most marginalised girls won't return. And we can, if we choose to, take the best of this technology with us. Not for every occupation, obviously not everything can be done virtually, but take the best of it with us to enable us to have more workplaces that are able to better combine work and family life, and also better able to assess merit. That is, they're assessing what workers are doing and their outcomes, rather than who's socialising, who's on the networks, who's in the corridor having the right kind of chats in offices and workplaces. So I think all of those things are still to play for, and we can make them come true if we keep arguing for them and pushing for them. Hopefully that's enough to give a little bit of optimism to you.
Yes, I hope so. Thanks ever so much, Julia. I'm going to come now, if I can, to Aya Chebi, who is the African Union Envoy for Youth. Aya, are you the first person to have held that position? Was it sort of created for you?
Yeah.
If you like?
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here. We have met before. I watched an event that you participated in yesterday, and was really struck by the Minister for Education for Sierra Leone, who was talking about the detail of his department's activities, to take Julia's point about how when all of the schools across the world do eventually reopen, the people who are most at risk would tend to be girls. We know from Ebola that there's evidence that shows that there will be millions of girls who don't go back to school, and that puts them at greater risk of early marriage, unforced marriage, pregnancy, gender-based violence, and what have you. I was very struck by the detail of the activities he's done in his department to protect the girls in Sierra Leone against that fate, with communication strategies and what have you. And he was very clear to say, 50% of people in my department are women, my head of delivery is a woman, my head of strategy is a woman, all my data people are women. How confident do you feel that that kind of nuanced and detailed understanding of the impacts on the most vulnerable girls and women across Africa are going to be kept precious and fought for as the world hopefully comes back to normal?
Thanks for the question. I think as a youth movement, or as a generation, we need to learn from the women movement, because if we will, I think it's two separate things, because if we talk about women empowerment or women in leadership in Africa, or programs addressed towards women, we have gone a long way. We even have an African Union strategy on women empowerment. We have Maputo Protocol. We have a lot of protective frameworks, and at the national level, we have national plans rolled out, and things are going in the right direction. But if we would talk about young people, I think as the largest youth population in the world, more than 65% under 30, we're the most marginalized and the most unemployed in the world. If you talk about refugees, the face of it is young people in Africa. We're the host to the largest refugee population. If you talk about migrant youth, it's the largest in Africa. So I think in terms of girls' rights and young people's rights, we are quite behind. And I feel it's more of a generational issue, because for me, the question now, after 6 months of the outbreak, the question remains to the elders and decision makers: what kind of word are you leaving for us? And is it fair that we inherit this unequal, violent, empty of values word? We are paying for a system we did not co-design, and yet we are inheriting this anyway. And so, and it doesn't come from a victim stand view or a blaming stand view. I was part of my country's revolution. We changed the course of history. We didn't wait for anyone to make change. And we were driven by inequality. It's my generation who democratized Tunisia, and our slogan was simple: freedom, jobs, and dignity. شغل, حرية, كرامة, وطنية. And yet, before the pandemic, after the pandemic, we still have the same slogan. So I feel there is a generational conversation that needs to take place. There is a generational accountability. There is a generational healing that needs to take place. And if we really want a fresh imagination of an equal world that we want.
You've done an extensive piece of listening or research, I don't know how you describe it, when you did your virtual consultations with 20,000 young people across Africa, to explore their key concerns about how this recovery is going to be put together. Just talk to us a little bit about what you discovered, because as you've laid out, intergenerational co-leadership of a path out of this is a big part of what you've been talking about in your role. Just help us to understand what you heard, because there are some amazingly exciting and innovative things that the young people across Africa have just got on and done, and I'd love to hear some of those.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't give much credit to young people in Africa, and they don't make the headlines, but African youth have shown unprecedented leadership and resilience during the pandemic, even though we're the hardest hit in terms of economic and livelihoods. Many young people lost their jobs, many education, they're being disrupted because, internet is a privilege in Africa. 70% of Africa is offline. If we want to talk about inequality, we have the biggest digital divide. And yet, young people would turn their offices into labs for producing hand sensitizers. They will go and do door-to-door raising awareness with a minimal, resources, and sometimes for free. So it's one of the populations of the world that perceives or subjected to the hardships and to the most hard conditions, and yet it's the most resilient. So I'm very proud of how young people have been able to fight coronavirus. In terms of the issue that young people raised during the consultation, there were 5, and one top of them is job security. And this is an issue we've been talking about for the past decades, and yet is not taken seriously. There have been papers written about it, there have been meetings, there have been declarations, there have been pledges of millions of dollars of this is jobs for youth, this is jobs for youth. And yet youth are asking, where is this money going? It's not affecting my life, it's not impacting my livelihood. The second thing was food security. Even though we don't talk about it much, but there is a prediction of hunger in Africa, because young people say, I might not die of coronavirus, but I will die with hunger. I cannot stand lockdowns. It would not work. The third was digital divides, because it disrupted education, because many of the youth who had their businesses online survived, and many of them who didn't, they're completely out of the digital revolution. The fourth, I would say, is gender equality. There is now we have really a crisis in South Africa. We have unprecedented rise of gender-based violence in Sierra Leone as well. So the gender issue came up strongly. And it's a cycle. So the more likely we see during the lockdown, the rise of child marriage, the rise of girls dropping out of school. And it's a cycle. The more likely you go through FGM, more likely you subjected to child marriage, the more likely you don't go to school anymore, or you drop out of school, and it continues like that. And the fifth, I would say just quickly, is really governance. For Africa, it's not just a health crisis. It's a governance crisis. We do not simply have the infrastructures to beat such a pandemic. And yet we had an experience with Ebola, and we had an unprecedented African leadership. But for us, the impact would not be the virus itself, but the impact of the virus on our lives, on our systems, on the inequality that is already existing, on the most marginalized and vulnerable who will be affected. So for us, it's really a governance crisis. It's about accountability. It's about fighting corruption. And it's an intersectional issue. We can't just say it's a health crisis.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aya. And it's great to hear the stories of young people just getting on and doing it their way. I hope that we can find a way to embed that systematically into the way the world responds. I'm going to come now, if I can, to Lord ONeill, who joins us. You're the chair of Chatham House, Lord ONeill. It's lovely to see you. Thank you for being here. There's been some great questions asked in the chat, and as James said in the previous session, you're sort of one of the world's great economic thinkers.
I blushed when he said that.
Peter Kahn is asking basically, do we need a massive rethink on economic strategy? I read a piece you wrote again earlier in lockdown where, you know, we just heard about the announcement of the furlough scheme and the sort of way the UK government in particular was targeting its sort of main fiscal efforts to support people through. And broadly, the point in the piece that you wrote was saying it would seem that this could be the beginning of a rebalancing in terms of income inequality in particular. Do you still hold that view? What are you thinking in terms of the big picture economically of how this is going to play out?
Well, thank you, Liz. Very nice to be with you, with especially such a distinguished panel. And I can't resist in saying when I called in for the end of the previous panel, and I wish I would have been there earlier when he would have told us exactly when the AstraZeneca virus is going to be ready. So I missed that. So please let me know on the sidebar. But even better than that, in between that session and this one, somebody had the wisdom to bring us in with Stone Roses, which are, for somebody like me, a proud Mancunian and an obsessive Manchester United fan. It was like, it's already brightened my day. So thank you for that contribution to equality. Let me say a few very quick things. First of all, I don't think it should be lost in the broadest discussion of inequality. For the past 20 years, global inequality has declined dramatically, contrary to what most people actually believe, because of the massive numbers of people taken out of poverty in China, India, some small parts of Africa and Latin America. And, you know, it's very fashionable and trendy to sort of slag off globalization, and this sort of slightly nonsensical deglobalization flies around. But on a global basis, it's not been true. What is true is within countries, we have seen significant deviations from what one would have hoped for and aspired for, although it's actually on a truly technical statistical basis, UK inequality is slightly lower than it was 25 years ago, which hardly anybody believes, but it's true in terms of income inequality. Secondly, to say, however, I mean, your question's sort of geared from a UK perspective, and I'll come back to it. But if you look at it, what's happened during this mess globally, surprise, surprise, and I love what Julia said quite rightly about women leadership. If you look at an index of sustainable economic growth around the world, one of which I created in my previous life as chair of chief economist of Goldman Sachs, but also UN development indicators. If you look at the countries that typically score the best on those, they are by and large, with some notable exceptions like Vietnam, but by and large, they are the countries that have the highest levels of shared wealth. So the example I love to really talk about is South Korea, which in my adult lifetime is the single most interesting country in the world, primarily because it's the only place of more than 50 million people that has taken its wealth to the level of a European country. And for Aya and young people in Africa, I always say to them, you get on when we can get on a plane again, or get on a Zoom call and quiz South Korean influencers, including current and past government people, how on earth have they done it? Because take what you can from them and introduce it into African countries. Because when I was starting my professional career, South Korea's wealth was the same as most African countries. It is incredible. And at the core of it, linked to one of the things to answer the UK on the indices that I'm so familiar with, is technology, not just technological development, but technological inclusion. If you look at indicators about the use of laptops and all sorts of access to technology, South Korea is one of the best in the world. And this shambles of how it's been handled in the UK, and we still live with it every day, is we don't have many particularly low-income people that have access to the greatest technologies. Can you imagine a bunch of low-income people across parts of the North and the Midlands trying to do what we're doing here? Impossible. And a major, major priority for this government, and I would guess in the United States, and also for a number of other Western democracies, is to have a much, much stronger commitment to giving technology or allowing technology to be available to all their citizens. And that not only would that allow us to deal with this kind of health crisis so much better, but it would actually allow us to deal with other issues to do with inequality so much better too. The last two things to say quickly, and I could rattle on forever, but the fourth of which is Julia is also completely right when it comes to, and I'm heavily involved domestically here, as I'm sure many listeners know, on the whole leveling up and Northern Powerhouse and stuff. It's kind of like one of my babies. And ultimately, it should be about equality of opportunity. And so education is by far and away, in my judgment, along with technology, where there should be much more serious efforts being done to create more equal opportunities. And as again, for our government, going to your question, this complete nonsense of the school A-level results for a government that's supposed to be committed to leveling up, to have stumbled into that mistake is amazing, amazing. And we need to be a lot more serious about it. So the disadvantage in many parts of the north of England and the East Midlands, probably the two worst regions of our country, their opportunities have been made even worse because of these things. And the only way to deal with it is to give them the right kind of educational support and encouragement and availability to have a better life. But now, finally, to come to your specific question, in the spirit of never letting a crisis go to waste, and it's something we're very strongly encouraging at Chatham House, what I call profit with purpose. We need to move into an era where business is encouraged or perhaps even forced to, instead of just purely wanting to maximize profit, is to optimize a number of objectives, including net zero climate change type things and aspects of so-called leveling up, possibly including specific things to do with equality of opportunity for women.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lord ONeill. There's a lot in there. It's a bit of a to-do list, actually, to make sure that we're covering all the bases. I think this question of equality is so big. My entry point with Julia was gender equality. It sort of seems like I'm pushing against an open door, but there's obviously there's a lot more to it than that. Rural and urban, north and south, connected and non-connected. There's a ton of fronts. I think we need to design a simple rubric that enables us to sort of tackle multiple inequalities in one bucket rather than treating them as individual things. I'm going to take some questions, if I can, from the people in the room. There's a few people I can see on my little attendee list that have had their blue hand up for a while. Could we try Adele Rudolph first, please? Are you there, Adele? Can we see and hear you? Can we see and hear Adele? I think she just takes a little while to come from one side to the other through the wall. Adele, are you there? And then I can see David McNair from the One Campaign has his hand up. So if we could start to bring David across as well, then we don't have the delay on the next time. Adele, are you there?
Hello.
Hello. What's your question or point or what you'd like to say?
Hello. I'm quite interested in the disparity between the rich and the poor. The two examples that I can talk about is South Africa, where it's a pity that the black middle class are not coming more to the forefront to help the underprivileged, because I lived under the apartheid regime, and unfortunately, I don't think the fate of the black workers has improved dramatically. There has been a creation of a black middle class, but I don't think enough has been done to uplift the impoverished section of the population.
Thank you, Adele.
Barry.
Oh,
Barry, Adele is my.
You're
Okay.
incognito, undercover.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I'm going to go now, if I can, to Edwin, who I know is already here. I can see him in my list, so we won't have the awkward delay. Edwin, what's your contribution? You're from the One campaign, I think.
Yes. Thank you, Liz, for this. I think that the key part that I thought was important to talk about here, really, it's about, how does the world, how does the leadership around the world really view this pandemic in terms of, collective action? What I think one of the biggest challenge really has been the fact that there's been so much nationalism around this that people are not seeing this external shock as an external shock that is affecting everybody. It looks like people are acting like it is affecting their own country on their own. And all of the inequalities, all of the things that have been exacerbated by this pandemic are showing up in different ways, but largely as well, increasing inequalities between the haves and the have-not, between the poor countries and the rich countries, with trillions of dollars, invested in stimulus and whatever, all of the things that are required to kickstart the economy, but not that kind of investment not happening in the global south, because the resources are not just there. And people are not looking at the comprehensive response that should take the whole world out of this together. For me, that has been a challenge, because when leaders are not looking at the future that looks at when this pandemic is over, there were some legacies that are going to be really telling. Aya has mentioned some. The young people in Africa, when the jobs are not there, if we're losing about 30 million jobs because of the pandemic, these people are going to be looking for a way out, and no other country will be spared. And that, for me, it's really amazing that we're not having that multilateral look at this, a global response that looks at the future as a world. And that, for me, is just amazing that I'm just wondering why we are not having that kind of conversation, why we're still having this nationalistic, individual, country by country approach that does not necessarily take us out of the problem. So that is on one end. In terms of the economic implication and the fiscal or the liquidity issues that have shown up, particularly very, very stark in the African economies, you are beginning to ask the question, why is it difficult to understand that this is a force majeure? It is a force majeure. So many contracts should be on hold right now, because this is what it is. Nobody planned for it. And so why are we not treating it as a force majeure? Why are some countries really feeling the impact, much more when it's a force majeure that nobody planned for? And countries are taking on measures that should have, that would protect people, that also has major economic implications, and other countries are not coming to the aid of these people because they don't see it like that. So I'm just amazed that we're not having that kind of global leadership, that leadership that looks at this as a whole, rather than looking at this as individual, at country by country basis. That, for me, is really a major gap in the whole response right now.
Thanks very much, Edwin. I'm going to go back, actually, if I can. I might just pick that up with Julia, if she's still there. Julia, I'm sure that there are sort of easy, therefore possibly not that helpful responses to what Edwin is saying about why is there not a more coordinated and significant global response to tackling this? Why do you think it is? You live in this world, you operate in this space. Why is that? Because it does feel that way. It just feels like we've all hunkered down in our own little countries, and how do we make that change?
Yeah, I agree that there's plenty to be concerned about here. I think that there's a few cross currents to unpack, and I'll do that as quickly as I can. One thing that I think, if we can go back to that word optimism, one thing that should give us some optimism is, in the face of this crisis, I think we've all had a real-time reminder that government matters and the quality of government matters. And in the lead up to this crisis, I think it was pretty easy for voters around the world, particularly in democracies where voting is voluntary, to just avert their eyes from government and to think, look, they really don't do anything that matters in a big way to my life. Now I think we've got a good case to say to voters, the calibre of your democracy can be a life and death issue when push comes to shove. So being an engaged, responsible, thoughtful voter is important. Second, this crisis has put expertise at the forefront. And we've certainly seen from the climate wars and from some of the dialogue around Brexit that there was developing this politics that, you know, experts are overrated and who wants to listen to them. And now we've all spent many months hanging off every word from chief medical officers and infectious diseases experts and the like. So I think recentering expertise at the heart of political debate is a positive trend too. In terms of the multilateralism, I'm not surprised that the initial response by each country was to hunker down and to manage the health and virus responses in your own nation. And that would have been taking every ounce of political time and attention. But I agree, this is the phase in which we should see much more emerging multilateralism around vaccine distribution, around global economy restarting, around making sure that the eradication of the virus when a vaccine is available happens in an equitable and coordinated way. Organisations that campaign in this space are all using slogans like, as long as anybody's at risk from the virus, we're all at risk. But we actually haven't seen much of the global political structures coalescing around those sorts of messages yet. What happens in the US election is going to be incredibly telling in this space. I mean, one of the big things that's missing in the temper of these times is US political leadership globally. A forward-leaning United States would make a big difference. Yeah. But we shouldn't just leave all of our fates to that. I think as powers around the world, you know, the UK, Australia, obviously G20 powers, we all need to be leaning into this multilateralism and trying to get a politics happening that says, yes, we've looked inwards, but now is the time to join hands. That's the only way to deal with the health challenges. And ultimately, it's the only way to truly restart the global economy. We don't live in a world where, you know, an individual nation can canter its economy ahead when the rest of the world is in a recession or depression. We're too interconnected for that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that's really helpful. I'm going to come back. I'd like to talk to David McNeck shortly from the One campaign if I can, but I just want to briefly go back to Aya with a question. When you talked earlier, Aya, about young people across Africa taking matters into their own hands, getting on and working on the ground with communications campaigns and all kinds of things. You know, there are many people in the UK are frankly in despair at the sort of institutional response at handling the coronavirus crisis. Do you have a sense of the motivation for that sort of youth-led, grassroots, practical activism to help the situation? Is that coming from a sense of we can and so we will, or is it coming more from a sort of, I don't think anybody else is going to do this, so it's up to us to get on with it? Is there the same sort of institutional mistrust, would you say, or where did that come from?
I want to believe that we're the most creative and coolest generation. That's why we pick up. I think it really comes from the fact that we are surviving. And so it's a matter of survival for you. You have to take charge of your own livelihood. And I want to address also a couple of things I'm seeing on the chat. So there was one who are talking about the generation gap. which I mentioned last time, that the average age of African leaders is 64 and the average age of the population is 20. And so I think the question remains, so I have the same question as you asking in the chat. I don't understand how leaders want to build the future without the future, you know, and I don't know how many revolutions we have to do in order to move forward to intergenerational co-leadership. The other thing I want to really touch on is when Jim said about South Korea having the same wealth as Africa as a continent. And I really want to emphasize that Africa is not poor. Africa has resources, it has diamond, it's one of the richest continents in the world, but Africa has historically been colonized. Africa has historically been exploited and has nourished the world economies, actually. Africa doesn't manufacture. The raw materials of Africa go outside, get manufactured, get back to Africa with 3 times the prices. So I think that's where Edwin was talking about global leadership. We need to look at, it's not about the country or the continent if it's rich or not, it's about the leadership. And I think that's when we talk about the management of resources or redistribution of resources, rather than are we rich or poor in resources. But also the global leadership, when we talk about the donor-recipient relationship, that has to change. And at the African Union, we've been very bold to say that we need equal partnerships. We need to move into talking about collaboration rather than, you know, Africa needs saving and we need help. Yeah. The same way that African youth, you know, can help movements around the world to organize, because we've been through all the hardships and we know exactly how to do it. You know, we've used all the strategies. And then also on global leadership, it's a matter of solidarity. And I think we still do not get the essence of what solidarity means. Solidarity is not changing your you know, Facebook picture and that's solidarity, or tweeting and using a hashtag. That's not the solidarity. Solidarity is believing that my liberation is your liberation, that my struggle is connected to your struggle, and that when you win in your own village, wherever you are, I will also win. I think that's the understanding of us being interconnected, and wherever, you know, when we stand in solidarity now with Black Lives Matter and people who say all lives matter and all that conversation. For me, it's like, if Black Lives Matter win, then we will win on the fight for people, indigenous people, then we will win for the fight of, you know, young people and female rights, when we win on the fight of indigenous people. So it's not one people's struggle or one community struggle. And if it's not my business, we have to care as a global community, because the more we win, the more the most marginalized is empowered, then me in my own village, in my own community, I will be empowered as well. And then the last thing is that I think for global leadership, I think it's just because we're ruled by the bad guys. And I don't understand why the good guys are not in leadership. And when people talk about into the chat of like analyzing female leadership and why the women who manage better, you know, the outbreak, for me, I want to believe that female leadership is about being emotionally intelligent and collaborative and not competitive. And it's about people being not linked and not ranked. So we don't need new model of leadership. We can learn from female leadership and just look up to that leadership. The issue is that people have done great in their own countries and there is great leadership, but globally, and those who you know, decide on global governance are still the bad guys there. And so we need more of the good guys in those spaces.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great. I'm going to go to David McNair now, who's been patiently waiting from the One Campaign. It's one of our partners for today. David, you've always got super interesting and important things to say in this space. Just weigh in with your perspective if you can. We need to unmute David if we can, please. There we go.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I mean, I think this is a once in a generation event, and, you know, history books will be written about the days and the weeks and the months that we're living through and the decisions that leaders made. But moments like this also lead, you know, have in the past led to, you know, dramatic changes, you know, the League of Nations, the United Nations, Bretton Woods institutions, and so on. And I suppose my worry is that in all these discussions about Build Back Better, you know, we counted 52 coalitions that are talking about this, and they all have amazing ideas on pandemic preparedness, education, and so on. But is there the political space to drive those conversations forward? And you know, Julia's mentioned, you know, the US election being a really important moment. I think if there is a shift in administration, that will change the political calculus of lots of countries and will open a window for us to be ready. But we need to be ready with smart campaigns, with ideas, with pitches that we can get to those people in positions of power at the right time. But even if that does happen, another ex-Australian Prime Minister has talked about, Kevin Rudd has talked about, even if there's a change in US administration, the fight between US and China will remain. And therefore we need to look at pockets of leadership where coalitions can come together to achieve something. And when, the last time I remember the G7 or the G20 doing something meaningful is probably a decade ago. But whenever coalitions come together to address education through the Global Partnership for Education or Gavi or the Global Fund, amazing things can happen because people are there to achieve something. And I think the question is, like, how can we identify those leaders, give them the smart ideas, and then build a political will for those leaders to drive those forward? I think the obvious starting point is health systems and pandemic preparedness, but we need to address the global learning crisis. We need to address economic inequalities and other issues of productivity and job creation on the African continent. So I suppose my question is, how do we come together to do that in a smart way, which is focused and doesn't just mean that we're talking to people that we already agree with no impact?
And how do we do that? What's the step one for those of us who are all nodding furiously and saying, yes, David, what you said, what are the things that we practically can do to help to focus the political will in the right areas? Can we unmute David so he can say something, please?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've started doing is to build a toolkit of the best ideas combined with political intelligence on the leaders that want to drive those things forward, and then a bit on what the public think. And the latest polling data on desire for political cooperation on the COVID response, addressing people who are vulnerable, on investing in health systems is really encouraging. But we need to build a kind of political momentum behind that and drive those ideas forward. So this toolkit, brings together those ideas with the polling data and with the political intel. And we'd love, input on, others that have good ideas, but also, if you want to use them, if you want to, share it with your networks and kind of find ways of campaigning for these issues, or sharing and collaborating with others, we'd love to help in any way that we can. But the other thing is we can't work in silos. Education campaigners competing with health campaigners or climate campaigners for the same money, it just isn't going to work. We need to present a vision for the world that we want to see. And then we need to tell a story about what needs to happen to make that a reality.
Yeah. Thank you so much, David. And we're 1 minute to go at the end of the session. I've got a slew of hands up. I've seen Dorothy making excellent comments in the chat about making sure that, for example, lone parents' rights are protected and looked after. And there's a whole load more comments that we haven't had time for. I do hope that you'll stick around, because some of the sort of challenges that we've cracked open in this session this morning, we're going to come back to and have a proper focused look at later on in the day. The next session after this one, edited by Matt Dancona, is about fake news and misinformation, and that, I think, talks to the trust and transparency point that is super crucial about mobilizing not only sort of ordinary people in grassroots activism, but also focuses the mind in political governance structures as well. We're going to go again at the Sustainable Development Goals at 1 o'clock, and then this afternoon we've got a session specifically about global organizations, which I hope will really give us a chance to think about this thing about international coordinated and collaborative responses, to sort of shake us out of our slightly more nationalistic tendencies. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. We've had some brilliant contributions, of course, from Aya, from Julia, and from Jim, and from all of you who've contributed in the chat. I'm so sorry to the people that have had their little hands up that we didn't have time to come to, but please do stick around, and we'll see what my colleague Sam has lined up for us in terms of the musical interlude. It's time now for you to go and put the kettle on, have a drink, check your phone, don't look at Twitter, that never goes anywhere. But thank you so much to Aya, to Julia, and to Jim, and stick around and we'll see you back here at, I believe, 11 o'clock. Thank you so much. Bye.